Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Michelle Deutschman, the Executive Director of the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. I'm excited to kick off our annual Fellows in the Field interactive workshop series just in time for back to school. If you're new to the center, welcome. If you're a regular, we are happy to have your continued participation and support. Fellows in the Field workshops are an opportunity for folks in the field like you to hear directly from our fellows about their projects and their practical application to day-to-day life on campus. If you have not had a chance to see the terrific research of all of our fellows, we'll drop that link into the question and answer. Speaking, pardon me, speaking of the Q&A, sorry, feel free to share your questions and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible. If you want to enable captioning, click the button at the bottom of your screen that says turn on captions. So it's no secret that legislatures across the country have shifted into overdrive regarding introducing and passing laws that attempt to control what can be taught in K through 12 and higher education classrooms with a focus on issues related to race and LGBTQ communities. Jacqueline Pedota's work, sorry, I have to have some water, over the last year has focused on these well-coordinated, well-funded attacks on institutional autonomy and the negative consequences they are having, in particular for racial inclusion. These bills specifically target the crucial role faculty play in promoting racial inclusion through their teaching, research, and service. Her findings and recommendations are critical. Before we turn to those, I want to tell you a little bit about Jackie. Jacqueline Pedota is a doctoral candidate at University of Texas at Austin within the Educational Leadership and Policy Department and works as a graduate research assistant under our other guest, Dr. Liliana Garces. Jackie currently works on a project funded by the Spencer Foundation that examines how law-based pressures shape campus-wide inclusion policy. Jackie's own scholarship explores issues within the higher education communities at the intersection of race, power, and organizational change. Prior to pursuing her PhD, Jackie received her Master's of Education from UT Austin and her BS in Wildlife Ecology and Conservation from the University of Florida. Jackie, I want you to kick it off by telling us, how did you get interested in this work initially, and why this specific project?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. So this study was, of course, heavily informed by the current and prior work of Dr. Garces, where a lot of the work has focused on how laws and other types of legal pressures shape racial inclusion policy and practice within higher education via the work of institutional actors like administrators. And I've been really fortunate to have been a part of some of that work. Additionally, my prior experience as an administrator who used to work very closely with faculty greatly influenced how I came to this project and how I conceived this project. I saw how faculty, through their teaching and research, had a really important role in furthering racial inclusion, not just within higher education, but also within broader society. And so as I saw, the restrictive bills being proposed and the initial media reporting detailing how colleges and universities were responding or not responding, I felt a strong sense of urgency to more systematically explore how the legal landscape was impacting faculty whose work focused on racial inclusion.
That's great. And I think urgent is one of the key kind of watchwords right now. So, okay, before we dive deeper into your findings, Jackie, I want to introduce our other guest today, Dr. Liliana Garces. We are so excited to have her back. This is not her first time, but her second time as part of a Fellows in the Field workshop. Dr. Garces is a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. She also holds courtesy appointments at the University of Texas School of Law and the Center for Mexican American Studies. Her scholarship broadly examines how legal and education systems shape educational opportunity and create inequality for historically marginalized student populations. Dr. Garces holds a doctorate in education from Harvard University, a JD from the University of Southern California School of Law, and a Bachelor of Arts from Brown University. So Liliana, you've been thinking about these issues for over a decade now, and I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about your own research and then how the landscape has maybe changed in the last 5 or 10 years.
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you for the invitation to join again and to join Jackie's presentation today. So as you said, yes, in my research, I examine how both the legal and education systems interact, come together to shape educational opportunity for students. And a lot of my research has focused on policies like affirmative action, race-conscious admissions in post-secondary education. And starting in about 2015, 2016, and the lead up and the wake of the presidential election at that time, colleges began to experience an uptick in instances of hate speech on their campuses. And as a legal scholar, I understood under the parameters of the First Amendment that university administrators couldn't stop these incidents. But as an educator and a researcher, I also understood the real harms that they posed for marginalized students, harming sense of belonging on campus, students' basic ability to focus on their academics. And so I became interested in examining how institutions were responding to these incidents in the context of this broader social political climate, because those responses had real implications for campus racial inclusion policy. And I was fortunate to receive funding from the Spencer Foundation to conduct this study. And what I and my co-authors, a team of graduate research assistants at the time, now either postdocs or tenure track faculty or those in administrative leadership positions now, what we learned was that in the aftermath of these incidents, students of color really wanted administrators to respond in particular ways that they felt would help restore their sense of belonging on college campuses after these incidents. They wanted administrators, for example, to acknowledge the harm that these incidents posed for racial inclusion, or to connect them to larger structures of racism that permeate our society. And even though administrators saw the value in those responses, many wanted to engage in those actions, which were also completely lawful, because we're talking about responses in the aftermath of incidents, not about stopping that speech itself. Administrators still felt that they couldn't engage in those responses because of the political environment that they were in. They were worried that a conservative legislature, for example, would perceive those responses as chilling the speech of those who were engaged in the hate speech, or they were concerned that they would open themselves up to lawsuits from external organizations that would then frame those responses as institutional overreach that trampled individual liberties and conservative viewpoints, instead of as efforts to promote racial inclusion in the aftermath of those incidents.
So one of the things I have learned from you is the term repressive legalism, which I know is something that you and your team coined. And I think is our final table setting before we turn to Jackie's findings, if you could sort of just give sort of the condensed version of repressive legalism. I think you just gave a good example of how it functions, but just to kind of round that out.
Yeah, so this is a term that we use to explain that dynamic that we captured in those findings, a dynamic of how administrators' perceptions of that legal and political environment ended up shaping their actions in a way that unnecessarily suppressed racial inclusion efforts. And this is, I think, an underexplored but prevalent dynamic that is shaping racial inclusion policy and practice in higher education. It's a concept that is meant to be a lens that can help bring attention to how pressures from outside the institution, outside of a college or university, end up shaping what administrators in higher education consider to be possible or not possible. As I mentioned, there were these types of responses that students affected by incidents of hate speech wanted, and there were responses that administrators wanted to engage in, but they didn't see them as possible, even though they were. And you can think of it kind of like a chilling effect, and that's at play for sure. But when we call it chilling effect, we're focused on the actions that are suppressed, right? The rights that are not being exercised. We're not necessarily focused on the forces that are leading to those reactions, to that suppression. And those are forces like actors outside the institution who end up leveraging the law in a particular way to shape those perceptions and those understandings that administrators hold. And then administrators give them meaning through their actions when they decide not to engage in certain actions or not, that are otherwise legal and that are in service of racial inclusion. And so in the case of that study, it was organizations that leveraged the threat of lawsuits under the First Amendment. In the context of Jackie's research, it's the threat of proposed legislation that affects what faculty can teach in the classroom, or the types of research that they might engage in, what PEN America has termed the censorious legislation. Proposed bills that frame concepts related to race, like implicit bias or critical race theory, as promoting divisive sentiment instead of advancing understandings of race and racism, or that frame DEI programs like identity-based cultural centers as initiatives that promote preferential treatment instead of policies and practices that support the success of marginalized populations in higher education, which research documents. So when we were talking about the project that she would propose for the fellowship, we wondered whether a similar dynamic might be playing out in this related social political context, where the threat of legislation could end up shaping perceptions of faculty in particular ways.
Thank you. And I just want to note two things. The first is that in addition to Jackie's research, a two-pager that both of our guests have put together on repressive legalism is now kind of in the chat. And the other thing I just want to mention is what you're talking about, Liliana, is something that we've talked about on past Fellows in the Field and Speech Matters conferences, which is what sort of happened with bias response teams, and how with the threat of, either actual litigation or the threat of litigation, a lot of schools just folded and settled and said, forget it, we're not going to respond anymore. We'll just have a campus climate group, again, because of the fear of litigation. Okay, so with that grounding, we're going to turn finally to the main event, which is Jackie, and maybe you want to just start at the beginning and sort of tell us a little bit about how you selected your site and how you decided who to reach out to, and how you built those relationships in what is really a very, I think, scary and sort of vulnerable environment for faculty, especially who aren't tenured.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. So in conceiving this project, I knew that I wanted to do a case study within one institution so that I could focus all my time and energy gathering, rich, in-depth data that could serve to provide a more nuanced and complex story about how faculty are responding to these law-based threats. And so I developed a set of criteria to pick that site. And so the first being, of course, being an institution within a state that had proposed restrictive legislation that targeted curriculum and knowledge production focused on race, what the media has, most commonly referred to as anti-CRT bills. But also, I wanted to account for proposed bills that seek to defund DEI initiatives. Again, kind of been coined as anti-DEI bills, because we know many of these bills were proposed not long after the first wave of anti-CRT bills, and they could still possibly have a chilling effect on faculty's work. The second criteria being the institution had to be in a state with a Republican-controlled legislature, since we know much of the backlash that has been led by Republican legislators. The third criteria being that the institution had to be a public four-year university. We know that they navigate different legal parameters when compared to, for example, private institutions. And lastly, I wanted to make sure that the institution had some sort of already documented incidents of faculty grievances. Maybe faculty were already starting to organize on campus, or some type of involvement by external organizations like AAUP. I also knew throughout this process, as you were kind of alluding to, it was really crucial to keep the site anonymized, given the real fear that faculty are feeling and the possible threat of real harm or retaliation that they might experience from speaking out publicly. So as far as those that I, chose to reach out to, I wanted to be really intentional. And so I purposely selected faculty participants based on, if they taught courses related to race, if they conducted research that interrogates race or racism, and also if they've been involved in any sort of faculty organizing to combat these law-based threats. For instance, through formal faculty groups such as faculty senates, many of them exist on many college campuses. And I also followed up with those that I interviewed to see if they had any suggestions of other folks that I could interview. Again, just given the difficulty in recruiting for this study, which I'm happy to talk more about. But overall, I ended up talking to 22 faculty members at this one institution, where a little over half of them were faculty of color. And of those, 6 were Black faculty. While I was able to speak to 9 untenured faculty, again, very aligned with what you were sharing, and not surprising, most of the faculty I spoke with were tenured, as they felt more protected or able to speak out about their experiences. Lastly, as far as discipline or field, most of the participants were either in more social science or humanities departments, with a few from the law school and 1 in STEM. But as far as like building relationships, yeah, it was really challenging to reach folks. I'm not gonna lie. I think we
don't need you to lie.
Yeah, I'm like, I think we all understand the environment that faculty are facing right now within colleges and universities. And, to get people to speak with me during this time was difficult. There's this heightened uncertainty, there's this fear, and just outright anti-Blackness and racism throughout the country that is, can potentially harm folks, particularly Black faculty. We've seen that when people publicly speak out or are mentioned in the media, they face an increased risk of being doxxed or just very real threats of harm, receiving threatening emails or possible job loss or retaliation, other types of retaliation by their institution. So as a scholar, I commit to having research be a humanizing experience. And so for me, it's important to prioritize collective care, solidarity, and reciprocal relationships with participants, rather than seeing research as this purely extractive process. So I made it very clear to participants, both through my actions and words, that I deeply care about them and that I take very seriously the responsibility that I hold in taking the utmost care of their stories, and that I'm committed to supporting faculty beyond peer-reviewed publications, right, which is like the norm kind of in the ideal in academia. And I think that this commitment to action is important.
Oh.
For instance, I had a participant ask, reach out to me after the fact and ask for resources just to better understand like what is and isn't covered under academic freedom. And I made it a priority, to follow up and provide those resources, even if I myself didn't have those resources. Of course, I have Dr. Garces to support me in my work. So I think that those are just some ways to, once you show through your actions that you are supportive of participants, they are able to see that, and they're able to also connect you with others as well. So that was kind of my experience, is once they see you as a trustworthy person who is very committed to supporting faculty, it does open up doors.
Well, I was going to say, so that's the answer to how you built the relationships. I mean, it's no surprise that you were able to get such a, significant number because of the care that you gave. So, okay, so now we're ready. The $1 million question, which is, what are some of the things you found?
Yeah. So, I made a slide, and so through the slide that will come up, you'll be able to see that I came away with 3 main findings. So the first was that faculty weren't really clear when it came to how they understood the rights and protections afforded under academic freedom. Most really hadn't thought much about academic freedom until now, right, where they kind of have to. The second was that race, gender, and rank really mattered. It shaped how faculty felt they could respond or act amid the looming legislation. So for instance, many faculty of color felt like they had to make changes to their course content or their teaching approaches to mitigate possible risk. And some felt it got to a point where they had to leave the institution altogether. And this was especially true for Black faculty at this institution. Additionally, the type of college leadership that faculty also had mattered. Faculty with supportive college leadership, such as deans or department chairs, they felt more comfortable continuing their work, whereas those who didn't felt more pressure to make changes to how they approach their teaching. Lastly, I saw that as faculty groups and external organizations were organizing and trying to combat these law-based threats, these groups often chose only to reference infringements on academic freedom or use language that solely focused on academic freedom and not acknowledge the racial inclusion impacts. So while it is true and important that these are attacks on academic freedom, they are also attacks on racial inclusion, and it's crucial to address that. So from what I saw, this failure to acknowledge impacts on racial inclusion had unintended consequences, where faculty of color, especially Black faculty, didn't feel supported and didn't feel that like their experiences or challenges were being acknowledged or addressed.
And if I just have one follow-up, were the cases of faculty making changes to their curriculum and syllabi, was that happening even before laws were passed? Was it even as they anticipated that they might be passed, or was it actually when things became law?
Yeah, I would say that in an attempt to mitigate any sort of possible harm, I think folks were preparing, right? Preparing for the legislation to inevitably be enacted, and they were taking these steps to do so, to prepare for the fall semester, or if they taught in the summer, you know, they were very intentional to maybe appear more neutral, or, you know, provide a bank of readings where students got to choose their own adventure, right? Where it kind of, again, mitigated that risk and mitigated any sort of potential harm.
And if you can disclose this, the faculty members that decided to leave the institution, do you know if they went to a different institution or if they left academia altogether?
That's a great question. I think that, so one in particular left academia altogether. One went into, I guess, early retirement, although I don't know what early retirement is in academia. And then the other went to a different institution. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then I guess before we go back to, you know, Liliana and open it up for questions, I'm curious, how was this similar to what you anticipated or different, or did you not have any expectations?
Yeah, so, you know, from Dr. Garces's prior research, some of which I've been a part of, we can see that a bill doesn't have to be enacted as law for it to have an impact. And so in the study that Dr. Garces mentioned about the responses to hate speech, just the mere threat of a lawsuit can make a university leader overcorrect beyond what is legally required. So I came into this project kind of grounded in this prior work, already knowing that we need to take these proposed bills seriously, because even if they eventually don't become law, they can still have an impact on the ground for faculty engaged in racial inclusion work, especially among the most vulnerable faculty. So I imagine that faculty were going to take the necessary measures, you know, to protect themselves from harm. So now fast forward and, you know, I've completed the project, I've gone through the data. I was able to uncover more about administrators' roles in all this, specifically college level leadership like deans, college deans, and department chairs. From much of the preliminary reports and media articles, we've heard that university leaders and administrators have remained largely silent, or they've been compliant, with legislation as to avoid any sort of loss in funding. And this is true, but it's also true that some deans and department chairs are genuinely committed to racial inclusion and have tried really hard to support faculty, but they too navigate challenges. Because senior level leadership, such as the president and the provost, provided no communication, no guidance or support, it really left college level leadership at this institution solely responsible for supporting faculty. Thus, faculty and departments with supportive leadership were able to act and respond in certain ways to continue going about their work, while other faculty in departments with more compliant or silent college level leadership could not. For instance, several faculty detailed that supportive college level leadership would encourage them to write op-eds about the various legal and political pressures facing higher education. Some would aid faculty as they sought to build relationships with civil rights groups, and several would try to find creative ways to continue engaging in racial inclusion work. So I thought that that was, kind of providing a little bit more nuance to the reporting that, all administrators were being silent. And I think it's more complicated than that.
It definitely sounds complicated. And I'm seeing a couple questions come in. So I'm going to ask one now, either for you or Liliana, before we talk about sort of the implications of the research. And one attendee is asking about whether faculty spoke at all about engagement with peers. Was that happening when they were making decisions about their syllabi, whether to stay, whether to leave? And did any of the participants speak to leveraging networks and or communities of learning? Or did you feel like people were pretty siloed in making those decisions?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I know that for some faculty, that was the case, where that was the culture already in the department. Right? Like the department kind of has to cultivate that culture where folks, have those networks to lean on within the college. I didn't ask if those networks existed like outside of the institution, so that could obviously be the case. But I would say from my experience, it varied based off of the department, if that was already kind of embedded within the culture of the department.
I believe that some of the faculty too, Jackie, were, maybe you can speak to this, involved with other organizations as well, where they were trying to defend against this through either work with Faculty Senate or other civil rights groups, as you mentioned in your third finding. So a different kind of community of care, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I think I see peer, like I interpreted peer as, like colleagues, within the institution. But yeah, absolutely. Leveraging networks internally through formal groups and externally through, advocacy organizations like PEN America, professional associations like AAUP, and, civil rights groups that are at the forefront of challenging this litigation. Yes, there were several faculty that did build connections with these groups that helped shape how they could respond.
Great. So I think we kind of need to address one of the things, which is like sort of what are the implications of this work? And, Jackie, you've talked a little bit about that. If you want to build out a little bit sort of, from the micro study that you did, and then Liliana, if you want to build on that and talk sort of more macro, and then we can get to, solutions or remedies or potential remedies and solutions, which is like, what do we all do? Not just two of you doing the research, but all of the people that are on this webinar.
Yeah, so from this work, I see serious implications for racial inclusion policy and practice within higher education. So if institutional leaders don't act to uphold academic freedom and racial inclusion, colleges and universities will struggle more than they already do to recruit and retain faculty of color. We've seen this already in some initial media reporting within states where legislation has been proposed or enacted. since many of these faculty that are leaving or thinking about leaving foster racial inclusion through their teaching, research, and or student mentorship, their departure can worsen campus racial climate, leading to shifts in access and success within higher education for racially and ethnically minoritized students. So I guess jumping a little bit to kind of recommendations, next steps, you see a slide that, kind of presents some of the recommendations I put forth in the report, where, I suggest that institutions create long-term structures and proactive processes to define and orient not just faculty, but graduate students and administrators to academic freedom from the moment they step onto campus. Having an academic freedom committee isn't enough. We also know that some faculty have more power and privilege than others, again, as differentiated by race, gender, and rank. So how can we encourage faculty with more power to acknowledge and leverage that privilege to materially support other faculty with less power? This could look like taking on a diversity or race-related course that is being taught by an untenured faculty member of color. How can we support those vulnerable faculty in mitigating harm and lessening the additional burden that they are facing? So I think the least we owe each other is to check in with faculty of color and untenured faculty to see what we can do to materially support them. Lastly, internal and external groups, as well as university leaders, should work to intentionally connect principles of academic freedom to principles of racial inclusion. Using this combined framing can hopefully encourage faculty of color to feel seen and feel supported, and to ultimately remain at their institution. But this collective framing also serves to further institutional missions for the betterment of society. So academic freedom and racial inclusion should be a value and a goal of higher education. And I realize that this might be difficult for institutional leaders to make this explicit connection to racial inclusion during this time, but collaborating and partnering with external advocacy and civil rights groups is a promising way to move this work forward.
Yeah, I think.
I was going to say, go ahead. I was going to say, do you want to add?
Yeah, just to bring, I think that's a great segue into the kind of macro picture takeaways when we think about, I think Jackie's really outlined some really, her work has a lot of important implications for the current moment that colleges and universities are in trying to promote racial inclusion on college campuses, which includes supporting and retaining and recruiting faculty of color on their campuses. We're also in a larger socio-political context where political actors and organizations, individuals are able to shape educational policy and practice either through coordinated litigation, the threat of litigation, or proposed legislation that, even if it plainly violates legal principles or constitutional principles, by the time that gets all sorted, it's already shaped the practice of educators by suppressing racial equity focused work. And so if we want to change the chilling effect that this sort of repressive legalistic context is having on the work of faculty and administrators, we really need to address those external pressures that end up creating that effect. I wholeheartedly believe that education professionals, faculty, and administrators, they really want to act in the best interest of their students. And at this time, they're facing pressures that can feel insurmountable in this context. And we need to think about ways that can help reduce that weight and that can help push back against those pressures. And the role of policy organizations, other advocacy groups like AAUP, PEN America, your center, other policy like the American Council on Education can play a really important role for providing faculty, for example, with a clearer understanding of what's permissible, what's not, to help feel more empowered in understanding their rights and responsibilities under academic freedom and related protections under the First Amendment. And so we need to, I think, attend to, how can we build broader coalitions to help educators address this current context so that they don't succumb to the pressures. And there was a really important finding, I think, from Jackie's work, is that those faculty members that were working in coalition with advocacy organizations, it helped them encourage to mobilize around academic freedom. And we need to build, I think, similar coalitions for mobilizing around supporting racial inclusion policy as well.
So speaking of mobilizing, there's a really interesting question that came in that I'd love to know either of your or both of your thoughts on, which is, did Jackie, in your work, did you get a sense from faculty how much these implications are transparent to students is like the first thing. And then, did you get a sense that whether student activism in this area see faculty as kind of in solidarity with them, or faculty, is part of the problem?
Yeah, I think that is incredibly important. And I know that there is an upcoming center project that is going to be answering this exact question or looking more into this question. But at this institution, no, I would say that there wasn't really this strong solidarity or even this like sense of awareness of like the severity of what was going on and how it was impacting faculty. I would say that, in asking faculty if, their students knew or had reached out to them, they said that they were kind of largely, I don't know if I would say oblivious, right? But I think that students are so preoccupied being students. I mean, students, they have so much on their plate. And I don't think that connection is very clear to them in terms of like, not only how it impacts faculty, but it impacts them, right? It impacts them, it impacts the education, it impacts campus climate. And so I think we've seen how some external kind of going back to what Dr. Garces said, there have been some external organizations that have not only supported in mobilizing faculty, but mobilizing students. And how can students mobilize around this restrictive legislation, to be in solidarity with faculty? So I think that at this institution, no, but I think it's needed.
Liliana, do you have any thoughts on that, just even from past work that you've done, or not necessarily?
No, I mean, I would just emphasize the point that Jackie mentioned about how much students already have on their plate. And, for this study that I began talking about in responses to hate speech, we saw that from that study, students ended up taking it on themselves to provide that support for one another. But then they also felt exhausted and just depleted from some of that work. And so it's an important role that they can play, but we really can't just rely on students.
Yeah. Another interesting question from one of our former fellows was asking if both of you can extrapolate a little bit more on the perception that there are weaknesses in the reliance on the academic freedom frame.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I think that and this is my interpretation of, using this as a frame, is that it can be successful in building a broad coalition with external groups and other faculty that maybe, see this legislation as, serious, but maybe they don't teach these courses. So using this framing of academic freedom, again, I can see the rationale behind it to build this broad coalition. And I think that, their folks organizing under this frame didn't necessarily consider the unintended consequence that I found through this study where, faculty of color, again, particularly Black faculty, didn't really feel supported because their unique challenges were not addressed. We know that much of the legislation, the language in the legislation is specifically targeting courses and research focused on race. And so I think that for those faculty, the faculty that I spoke with, they didn't necessarily feel that, in using that framing, they didn't feel like those, groups were for them. Those groups, weren't supporting them. And so I think that there are benefits, right? If you want to build, and it was successful in building kind of this large scale, broad coalition, but there are also consequences for racial inclusion via these faculty who have these important roles on college campuses to promote racial inclusion through their teaching and research.
So not really an either or proposition, if I'm understanding it correctly, right? I mean, it's just that right now, maybe if there's sort of a balancing, that the scales are tipped on, let's talk about academic freedom without necessarily giving nearly as much attention to specifically racial inclusion and how that's going to impact specific areas of academic freedom. Is that okay?
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay. Another question that came in was in terms of the first recommendation that you made. Do you have any examples of structures and processes that have been successful?
Yeah, and I present a couple in the report, but one that again I think is important, and in speaking with faculty, they kind of like even reminisced back to like when they were grad schools, right? When you're a grad student, you're like future faculty, and how folks weren't necessarily oriented to academic freedom. And so one kind of suggestion I posed was, how can we orient grad students when they have these TA trainings, as a grad student, right? I know there's these various like teaching trainings when you're either a TA or an assistant instructor. And so how can we embed academic freedom as a part of these trainings so that students can already start to understand and know what is and isn't protected under academic freedom, because we know that grad students will become future faculty one day. So how can we scaffold this and integrate it throughout every process of the academic journey for folks that intend to be faculty? So that's just one suggestion, but I think there's definitely a lot of work that needs to be done.
Well, it sounds kind of similar to what when I train or facilitate workshops about free speech, that one and done isn't going to be enough, right? I mean, yeah, you can talk about free speech and the First Amendment at a public university orientation, but like you both have emphasized, these students have so much on their mind, how to live on their own, that if that's the only interaction with free speech when something comes to a head, that they're not going to have like those skills to rely on, right? Okay, another interesting question, again, kind of flipping it. Have either of you talked with faculty that have shared experiences of being challenged about the content of course materials under the guise of the ongoing legislation, where students actually like, hey, you're not supposed to be teaching that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And so it's speaking with faculty, my understanding was that most of the kind of concerns were like coming from external to the university. I spoke with faculty and students. I mean, students, they're so bright and intelligent and want to talk about these topics. And so a lot of the kind of like criticism or pressure is more so coming from outside of the institution and not necessarily from the students themselves. And so that from speaking with the folks that I spoke with, that's kind of what I took away from.
And I'm going to just give a shout out because we had talked about how Liliana had been on another Fellows in the Field, and that was with Ryan Miller's amazing work. And I think he might even be on. But either way, this idea of Ryan sort of saying, hey, my goal isn't to focus on all the external pressures, but the internal ones. And what he ended up finding was that it was really the external forces that were having the impact on how folks responded to bias response teams. And I think we're going to also drop Ryan's research in there, because I think all of these things are tied together to go back to what Liliana was talking about, which is that what do we do when the law doesn't provide us a remedy for the impact of harmful speech? And that a lot of the things that have been put in place to respond to that harm are now being repressed because of these external forces. And, Liliana, I don't know if you have more that you want to add about things even more broadly that people can be thinking about doing in the content of, you know, racial inclusion and bias, whether it's happening via an academic who needs to change this, or decides to change the syllabus, or a student who, you know, sees a bulletin sign on a bulletin board and feels like they're not welcome on their own campus.
Yeah, so I think about, you know, there are these external pressures, and then thinking about the internal dynamics, one really key actor is general counsel within an institution, right? And the guidance, how they might, they play such an important role, especially when, you know, with legislation, whether it's proposed or it's passed, how is it going to be interpreted and implemented? And oftentimes the parameters for the law are not clear. And you know, when things aren't clear, it's completely rational to default to a place of caution. It's understandable response for administrators to kind of go to like, well, I'm not going to do this because I don't know if it's covered or not. And also for legal counsel to default to that place of caution, right? As someone who's been trained in law, I understand the importance of counseling for an institutional response that avoids risk for institutions. And when I think about the mission of institutions of higher ed and the important role that they play in a multiracial democracy, that's the risk that I worry about, and that I hope is also in the minds of general counsel as they're determining appropriate responses, because the risk is that as educators, we may not be advancing our mission in the face of these restrictions and these external pressures. And part of that mission includes facilitating understanding across racial difference. That's something that we desperately need in this time in our society. And that's what racial inclusion policies and practices help us achieve. Ultimately, it benefits everyone and it enriches the quality of education for everyone. But it's still an incredibly difficult time for that work. And I would just say that I hope our mission at institutions of higher education serves as an anchor for guiding the interpretation and the implementation for all the actors involved, those that are giving the guidance, the general guidance, and those that might be facing some uncertainty with what the parameters might be.
Well, I'm going to double down on your point that legal counsels can be your friend. No, but I mean, in seriousness, I mean, we're two attorneys on here, and I think there's, you know, it's sort of a, you know, an ongoing joke about, you know, you get a lawyer and, you know, everything is, you know, stopped, or, you know, lawyers make things hard. But my experience has been that they're not always included in the conversation, and it's really important. And that the goal of attorneys, especially campus counsels, isn't just to make things difficult, it's to make things less risky. And I think people need to remember that you know, a lot of people come to higher education law because they care about all the things that we're talking about. And so I guess one challenge I would give to people is, if you're someone on this call, most of people who are from an academic institution, if you have never connected with someone in your campus counsel's office, if you have one, then like that's something to do, right? Maybe one small takeaway. So we're sort of getting towards the, you know, the end of things. And I want to make sure, I mean, we've talked about a lot of different issues, and I give each of you sort of an opportunity to sort of look ahead. I mean, I think it's going to be, you know, an interesting year. I think there's so much happening as the election cycle goes into higher gear. And just any words that you have for folks on campuses, especially vis-a-vis racial inclusion. I think yeah, I don't know, Jackie, do you want to start?
Yeah. I just want to, you know, double down on, you know, the need to build coalitions across campus with faculty that are untenured, with faculty that are faculty of color, with students. And so I think kind of we are stronger together. That is generally, you know, my perspective. And I'm hoping that through this work and future work that I'm able to engage in, I can encourage folks to just be in solidarity with one another, because what affects one of us, I truly believe affects all of us. And so that's just kind of the last thing I will leave you all with.
Before I turn to Liliana, I'm going to volunteer Jackie in the sense that, her email's available on our website and her research, but I also think that so we've talked about a particular site where things have been impacted in a negative way. If you happen to be at a place where some of these structures have been built and you have suggestions for how others can do it, I would say drop it in the Q&A for everyone, send it to Jackie, send it to me so that we can share it. Because I do think that part of solving the problem is being aware of what the problems are and their impact. But I also think we need to spend time thinking about and asking people, hey, are you somewhere where something, even if it's a small thing, is working well? So I'm going to throw that out there before I turn to Liliana.
Yeah, so I would say from this work, and it'll continue, we're going to continue to expand this research and hopefully engage in it in a way that is both, systematic, but also informs the practice and responses on a kind of time-sensitive manner. So hoping to do that through the work, and I know Jackie's committed to doing that as well. And one important thing I think for faculty to remember is that they're not alone. They're not alone in these challenges. And it can feel like that when you might be in a place where perhaps you're not hearing things from high-level administration, or as some of the participants, found themselves in Jackie's study. And that can really be very disheartening. But faculty are not alone, and we have protections, we have rights and responsibilities under academic freedom that we can empower ourselves with, and that can serve as an anchor for engaging in responses that at the end of the day are really about students and making sure that we're serving them well and that we're able to promote the mission that we are in this profession to do for public institutions of higher education. And it's work that is more critical than ever as we try to really fight for defending our multiracial democracy and the principles that are so fundamental to it.
Well, that certainly is a perfect way to end. And I think one of the threads that's kind of been spun through this whole hour is this idea of building community. And so I think we all have a role in that. And I'd like to think that the center, that's really at the heart of what we do, to build communities of fellows, interdisciplinary communities of people that are interested in struggling with this work. And so we will all just continue to labor towards what we think is sort of the ideal. In the meantime, I want to thank both of you so much for joining us. So grateful, Jackie, to you for your great work, and Liliana, for you joining us. And I want to remind people, please don't forget to sign up for our other Fellow in the Field webinars. Keep your eye out. We're going to have an installment of Ask the Experts coming out later this week on AI in the classroom. And then after the long weekend, we'll be dropping our back to school podcast episode where UC President Michael Drake will be our guest. So lots of things to look forward to. And we'll look forward to being in touch with all of you. Thanks so much.